On cue, excellent. So, welcome everyone. My name is Professor David Flynn, and I am the chairperson for this online discussion today. And we're very grateful to have you with us as purely just a very quick 5-minute introduction to the initiative that's really brought us together here, because I know you're all very interested in listening to these community perspectives and the experiences of our two speakers today. Let me just give you an update and a bit of awareness regarding the EPSRC and stakeholder supported HIACT initiative, which is Hydrogen Integration for Accelerated Energy Transitions. Now, HIACT is a stakeholder co-created programme of work led by our colleagues at the University of Newcastle. And through this link, which we'll see at the bottom of the slide, you're going to get access to the stakeholder consultation and findings that this large interdisciplinary team of academics has been pulling together. So since April last year, our colleagues here have been involved in supporting engagement with communities, policymakers, industrialists on what are the priorities in terms of the challenges and opportunities for hydrogen integration. Okay, now you'll be grateful. I'm not going to give you the background story for this very large team, albeit very interesting and colourful as they are in their abilities and attributes. You can find the details of their profiles on the associated link below. But this consortium is led by our colleague, Professor Sarah Walker, who's in the very top left of your screens. And we will be leading this really community-centred and stakeholder-informed initiative going live in around about anticipated timeline of about May this year, all being well. So you can see some brief details here on this hydrogen hub. Now, we have around £10 million of initial investment from EPSRC and over 4 million in growing from stakeholders to really work together to look at the challenges, the opportunities in how hydrogen can help us decarbonize our energy services, how hydrogen can play an active role in community prosperity and industrial sector prosperity in terms of the circular economy that really does underpin that energy transition. Okay. As part of this engagement process, and to be true to keep into my 5-minute window here, it really has been about doing some deep dive engagement with communities, with local governments and citizen groups to understand that the real kind of awareness levels, the ambitions, the potential barriers to adoption of future hydrogen services. At the same time, we've been working with the network operators, the technology providers, engaging with the policymakers, as well as the investors that we need to bring that green finance into a scalable hydrogen economy. So a lot of learning's been happening. We've made it open access and readily available as we've went. So as I say, if you ever want to take a look at the findings of our surveys, our mapping of hydrogen activity in the UK, type, location, scale, this is all readily available for you to engage with. And of course, we welcome discussions with you on how we can collaborate in the area of the UK's hydrogen economy. Okay, so I will leave that for now as part of the HIACT framing, and my colleagues will be relieved, I'm sure, that I'm doing my best to keep to time, because we've got some excellent speakers who we're going to hear from today to share us our to share their experiences of engaging with energy transitions and the role that hydrogen does and doesn't play in certain scenarios. So one of our first speakers that we have today, and I'm really pleased that he's been able to join us, is Dr. Matthew Scott, who is a Senior Research and Policy Officer at National Energy Action. And most of you, I'm sure you're aware, but National Energy Action really supports raising awareness, educating and understanding around fuel poverty across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So clearly it's so important to have such views when, I think, if we were to reflect on what's happened in the energy crisis in the past year in the UK with, 141% increase in gas costs and 96% increase in electricity. It's going to be really insightful to listen to Matthew on what him and his team have been doing through the NEA. So in that regard, I would like to hand over to Matthew, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much. And Matthew, if you could share any material you wish.
So it's coming now. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Excellent, thank you.
Excellent, I'm seeing thumbs up. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the introduction, David, and thank you to all of the HIAC team for the introduction and for the invitation to come and speak to you all today about hydrogen. As mentioned, I'm Matthew Scott. I work as a researcher at the fuel poverty charity National Energy Action. The charity campaigns so that everybody has the right to be able to afford to live in a warm and safe home. And we do that through various different channels, research being one of them. Our role in the HIAC consortium has been to look into some of the community engagement, so to understand what people and different stakeholders think about hydrogen and where they think it may have different applications across the economy and where they think it can contribute to their own aims and objectives. But it's also been to have a look at the role that hydrogen might play in decarbonising domestic heating, which as a fuel poverty charity is the core concern of NEA. So just to give a little bit of structure to the presentation, I'm going to begin by setting a little bit of context around the decarbonisation of domestic heat. I'm going to talk about the challenge, and I'm going to talk about some of the options for doing so, which will lead me to hydrogen. And then I'm going to talk through some of the initial scoping work that NEA have done on the connections between hydrogen, fuel poverty, and the decarbonisation of the housing stock in the UK. So I'm going to begin by presenting a couple of graphs that some of you may be familiar with, and you'll certainly be familiar with the picture and the story that they tell. The global temperature change since around 1850 has been unprecedented, and as the graph on the right shows, it has certainly been higher than we would have observed in natural circumstances as a result of man-made global warming. Now, in the UK, with regards to the domestic heating sector, we think about 4/5 of domestic carbon emissions comes from space and water heating. So that's heating our homes through predominantly the combustion of gas in boilers, but also heating our water for practices of showering, bathing, washing, and so forth. And this is a supply that needs to be almost entirely decarbonised by 2050 if we're going to reverse these trends in these two graphs. And there's a number of different options for how we may do this, and some of these have been around for a long time, but I think it's fair to say that whatever your preferred option or whatever you may work on, we've been doing pretty badly at this over the past 10 to 15 years. So the graph on the left-hand side of the screen here shows the insulation rates in domestic housing from around 2010 to the present day. As you can see, from around 2010 to about 2012, domestic insulation rates and retrofit rates were high, they increased. This was predominantly done through the Green Deal and through some of those programs introduced just prior to 2010. But then famously, as this graph is now shown, and there's many versions of this graph now, insulation rates dropped off a cliff in around 2013 and have never really recovered. And this graph, which is taken from the Committee on Climate Change, shows the forward projection for what needs to happen to insulation rates if we're going to hit the target of net zero and of decarbonising the domestic housing stock. So insulation is a really critical part of the story of how we do that. But with regards to heating technologies, there's three that tend to be spoken about. The first is heat pumps. On the right-hand side of the screen here, you can see historical heat pump installation rates and the CCC's projection of what needs to happen to heat pump installations if the government is to meet its target of 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028. And as you can see, that's an exponential rise that needs to take place. And there's mixed views on the extent to which that is realistic with regards to supply chain challenges and all of the other challenges that we experience in this area. So that leaves us with two other options, which will both also play a role as well as heat pumps. The first is heat networks, or sometimes district heating. According to estimates by the Heat Trust, heat networks currently account for around 2 to 3% of heat demand in the UK. And at present, about just over 90% of these heat networks are driven by a fossil source of one kind or another. So whether that's waste incineration or something else. The CCC estimates that all new heat networks will be zero carbon by about 2025, and with existing heat networks all decarbonised, retrofitted, if you like, by around 2040. And they anticipate that heat networks will cover about 1/5, 20-ish% of heat demand in the UK by 2050. So then the third option for decarbonising heat is the one that we're here to discuss today, which is hydrogen. The UK government has done a lot of work in recent years in preparing the ground for this option. They've funded hydrogen blending trials, first at Keele University and then up in Winleighton, which is just outside Gateshead in the northeast of England. And there are now plans for subsequent trials, the hydrogen village trials, which BEIS and Ofgem are currently working through, and then a hydrogen town trial towards the end of this decade. And the idea behind this is, on the surface, relatively simple. You remove the natural gas from the current gas network, you replace it with hydrogen, and you use that to heat and power homes instead of methane. And hydrogen is deemed to be a good option for doing this because when burned at source on a hob or in a boiler, the carbon emissions is zero. So it's deemed by some to be an effective and potentially large-scale route that could be rolled out at pace in the 2030s. But of course, as we mentioned, we're now at a particularly sensitive point with regards to the decarbonisation of domestic heat because we're currently in an energy crisis. So on the left, you can see what has happened to the default tariff price cap from October 2020 to April 2022. It went from just over £1,000 to just under £2,000. So that was nearly a doubling of domestic energy costs in about 18 months. And as the timeline on the right-hand side of the screen shows here, this has accelerated even further in recent months. So on the 26th of August, Ofgem announced that the default tariff price cap from October, just gone, would have been about £3,500 a year, which would have represented over a tripling of energy costs from that initial October 2020 date. As we now know, the short-lived Liz Truss government stepped in and announced the energy price guarantee, which limited domestic energy costs on the average household bill, so not the unit rate, the average household bill, to £2,500. And the latest announcement is that this is going to reach £3,000 from April 2023. So at NEA, with all of this sort of going on and forming the context, we are really of the firm belief that the decarbonisation of domestic heat and the tackling of fuel poverty need to be hand in hand. We cannot do one without the other, and there is no transition to net zero which does not pass through fuel poor homes. Because we know that improving the energy efficiency of fuel poor homes means warmer, healthier homes, it means improvements in the economy, and it means that people have more money in their pocket to spend on other things. And as we know, as the next slide shows, there's a significant number of financial challenges that people are facing at the moment and will continue to face And so reducing people's energy costs, reducing people's running costs, and improving the energy efficiency of their homes is absolutely key. So the next question then is, what are some of the challenges and opportunities of hydrogen for doing this? And that's what I want to focus on for the second half of this presentation. I'm going to focus in on 4 things that our research into this area has uncovered so far. They relate to cost, they relate to safety, they relate to what I've put in scare quotes, fuel poor schemes, and then fourthly, they relate to aspects of the customer journey that might need to be thought through. So I'm going to go through these in turn. The first is safety. Hydrogen as a gas has different properties to natural gas. It is odorless, it's colorless, and it has different attributes with regards to how quickly it diffuses through the air, with regards to its ignition temperature, and with regards to other properties associated with its kind of chemical makeup. And consumer research, particularly that undertaken by Leeds Beckett University and elsewhere globally, has shown that safety and concerns about safety will be one of the key consumer points when hydrogen is talked about. And we think that safety risks may be more acute in fuel-poor homes as they would be in normal homes. This is for a couple of reasons. The first is that fuel-poor households may be more likely to have old or perhaps unserviced gas appliances. And while there would be new hydrogen appliances in a full hydrogen rollout, if fuel poverty is not addressed as part of that rollout, it is likely that those appliances would very quickly become unserviced. They might be not maintained as well and could present risks in the home if that takes place. And we also know that fuel-poor households undertake a range of what we sometimes call dangerous coping practices or coping tactics. This can be things such as restraining or rather staying in one room, so living essentially only in one room, such as a kitchen, and using unsafe or potentially unserviced heating appliances within that room to stay safe. And we've seen examples in the past of people living in their kitchens, using the heat from their oven to try and stay warm to avoid switching the central heating on. So there's a range of concerns that exist with natural gas presently, but which will need to be thought through if a hydrogen transition takes place in the future as well. Just going to move us on. Excuse me. The second consideration here is costs, and we've rendered this in 3 different ways in the analysis that we've done so far. The first is what we call the network costs or the whole systems costs. So I think there was some estimates from some academic work a few years ago, which put the cost of converting the entire gas network to hydrogen somewhere in the billions, somewhere in the order of the billions. And the simple fact is that this has to be paid for through one route or another. And there are different options that the UK government could use to implement this, which would probably form a mixture of private and public investment. So there would be a contribution from the government towards meeting the costs of this transition. A concern for NEA and a challenge for the hydrogen transition is how these network costs would be distributed across society. Currently, there are lots of costs with regards to electricity in particular, things like renewables obligations that are on the energy bill, particularly on the electricity bill, and that everybody pays for through their energy payments to their energy supplier. NEA has long been of the view that this is a slightly regressive way of doing this because it doesn't account for the fact that those in lower income brackets are the less able to pay these costs, and yet they pay proportionally the same amount as middle or higher income households. So we would need to have a conversation, we feel, in the future about how the costs of the hydrogen transition are met at a system level, whether this comes through taxation or whether this comes through some form of levy on bills, which was what was proposed last year as part of some of the government's hydrogen consultation documents when they released the hydrogen strategy. The second issue is capital costs. So this regards to things like hydrogen boilers, hydrogen pipework. So if pipework needs to be retrofitted inside people's homes, and other things such as day-to-day appliances, gas hobs, gas cookers, and other things that people use day-to-day in their homes that run on gas. There is a question regarding who would be expected to bear the costs of these appliances, and particularly for fuel-poor households, who we know, if they have a boiler breakdown at the moment, in the present day, they are very unlikely to be able to meet the costs of replacing that boiler on their own. So there's a challenge here around, it's a similar distributional challenge around who pays for the costs of getting hydrogen equipment into fuel poor homes and how we distribute that across society. And then the final challenge with regards to cost is running costs. The quote on the screen here is from Cadent, who's a gas network, gas distribution network, who along with the other gas networks have been at the forefront of some of the hydrogen development work that's taken place in the UK. And Cadent have said, as have others, that they expect the wholesale price of hydrogen to be higher than natural gas currently is. And this is as a result of the higher production costs of hydrogen. So whether it's blue hydrogen done through steam methane reforming or another avenue, or whether it's produced through electrolysis and is therefore labelled green hydrogen, whichever route it's produced through, it's expected that the wholesale cost to the consumer, so the price per kilowatt hour that is paid and achieved through the meter, will be higher. We know at the moment that running costs are unbearable for fuel poor households. And so we know that there would need to be some significant conversations and some work through industry and government as to how running costs are going to work with hydrogen. Thirdly, is fuel poor schemes. The UK government currently runs and operates a number of schemes that are directed towards improving the energy efficiency of fuel poor homes. Amongst these, there's ECO, the Energy Company Obligation. There's the Home Upgrade Grant Scheme, which is targeted at off-gas areas. And there's also the local authority delivery element of the Green Homes Grant. None of these schemes, for obvious reasons, it's not here yet, are set up with hydrogen in mind. The one that is slightly related is the Fuel Poor Network Extension Scheme, which is delivered by the UK gas networks to connect fuel poor households to the gas grid. There must be a presence of a fully funded heating system there to be able to enable that, to enable the household to get the system and the connection at the same time and can access the warmth and the benefits that come with that. But the Fuel Poor Network Extension Scheme increasingly is conflicting with the target of reducing gas connections and moving to decarbonised forms of heating in domestic homes. So we need to be thinking now, is our argument. We need to be thinking now about how we adapt the fuel poor schemes of the future with a potential hydrogen rollout in mind. What this could be is still up in the air, but fundamentally, if we don't do this now and we get to a hydrogen rollout at some point in the 2030s, if we haven't thought through how we're going to make it work for fuel poor households, then they are not going to get good outcomes from that transition. So we would like to see some thought taking place now or in the immediate couple of years as government works towards a decision on the gas network in 2026 as to what might these schemes look like and how can fuel poor consumers be best supported through the transition to hydrogen. And then lastly, there's a range of challenges that I've lumped under the words customer journey. So this relates to things like the time that people may be expected to be off supply when a hydrogen transition takes place in their home. For somebody like me, a few hours off supply while a transition takes place in my home wouldn't be an issue. But for some consumers, particularly with health issues, with respiratory conditions that rely on a consistent level of warmth in their homes, there are questions around how that might be addressed. There are questions around tenure. So this is the relative role and the sort of power imbalance between tenant and landlord, and who is responsible for making decisions in a particular home around what heating technology is adopted, and what kind of how that would be negotiated between tenant and landlord in the context of a conversion. There's some challenges around social practices and disruptions. So this refers to how everyday life, everyday tasks of cooking, heating, bathing might be disrupted by a change to hydrogen. We don't really know that yet. That's part of what we're hoping these hydrogen town trials will investigate. There's a whole piece around communication and engagement. So how do we ensure that everyone, all consumers, those with special needs and requirements, in particular communication needs and requirements, can be properly informed about hydrogen so they can make the right decisions for them and for their homes, and what those kind of communication frameworks might look like. And finally, there's an overarching and perennial question in NEA's work around procedural and recognitional justice. So what is the role of society and community in working through the possibilities and the challenges of the hydrogen transition? I think I'm just about on time. So I'm going to leave it there. I'll end just by saying thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And thank you again, HIACT, for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to answering any questions that you've got and having a bit of a chat about this.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was excellent. And what we'll do is we'll take questions at the end of Neil's talk. So thank you very much for that, Matthew. That was excellent. So Neil has joined us, and just as a quick introduction, Neil is the Managing Director of the European Marine Energy Centre, EMEC. He always has the best backgrounds of beautiful Orkney, so we're instantly envious. EMEC, for those of you that are not aware, the world's leading test facility for wave and tidal energy converters, but also EMEC are heavily involved in the development and deployment of hydrogen technologies, and Orkney as a living test bed for some of these advancing technologies. So it's absolutely brilliant to have Neil with us today to share the perspectives that him and his team in Orkney have in this area. So Neil, may I hand over to you?
Certainly, David, and thanks, Rashid. Can you hear me okay as a starting point? Excellent. Actually, my background is rather misleading, so I'm actually sitting at Kirkwall Airport about to get on a plane, so if you get the odd bing bong in the background, that's what's going on, so forgive me. And also, so there'll be some strange looks of people around me who are being educated into hydrogen, an unexpected bonus on their journey. I'm just going to share my screen, so see, here we go. And okay, so this is, as David said, we're heavily involved in marine energy. So I'm going to give you a little bit about why we came to hydrogen and take us off in a different direction to what Matt was talking about. So we've got a slightly different perspective on hydrogen and what we're doing with it. So if you do know where Orkney is, then this arrow is superfluous, but a lot of people don't. And if you think of Orkney, you often think of it as this bucolic landscape of beautiful sunsets and sort of idyllic towns, but you don't often think of it as having a large amount of wind turbines. We've got 1/9 of all the domestic wind turbines. I've got one in my garden. The bottom left is, the top right is the world's most powerful tidal turbine, and the bottom right shows some high energy efficiency houses which are going on, and something like I think it's 23% of the housing in Orkney has been built since 2000. So there's been quite a lot of development that's been going on. So Orkney is not quite just the bucolic landscape that you think of. So we started working on marine energy, so wave machines and tidal machines, like the one in the top right-hand corner. And in the years we've been working, we have had some 35 different devices, from 11 different countries and 21 different developers. And now we are embarking on our 20th year. And we have encountered a series of challenges, some of which relate to the grid. And we've ended up using the hydrogen as a way around some of the grid restrictions. This may be something that's going to be seen more widely in the UK as a whole. I'm just trying to see, are you actually seeing, David, are you actually seeing the side panel with the Zoom images on it as well or not? So I've got a series of photographs there, and I just don't know if it's covering up the screen.
I can see
right of the 11. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
So fine, just in case, I'm not used to working on a single screen, so forgive me. So anyway, so we've been working on different technologies for a number of years, and the journey we really take people on is a sort of a multi-step journey of where people try and install their machines. Do they survive in the weather? Are they reliable? Can they be maintained? And are they operable in a whole energy system? And once you've answered questions of your machines, questions about your machines like this, you then know whether you've got something that is actually cost effective. Now, so we started off looking at the grid as a way to export energy, and we've now moved towards hydrogen, so I'm going to explain why in a moment. But I just want to highlight the fact that even hydrogen technologies need to go through these same steps. Can you install this equipment you're trying to talk about? Does it survive? Is it reliable in whatever use you're trying to apply? can you maintain it, and does it operate properly? And that, once again, is going to lead you to cost effectiveness. And so the lessons we've learned in the marine space are directly relevant in these new technological areas of working with hydrogen. So why did we get in hydrogen? Well, really, it started off as storing electricity from things like the tidal turbine in the foreground, because the tides have got a very periodic output. Every 6 hours, the tide stops, turns around and goes back the other way. And so we end up with a rectified sine wave of power output. And in our case, we have a limited grid here because the population of 22,000 people in Orkney is supplied by a limited grid from the north of mainland Scotland. And so we were allowed to generate energy up as far as the green line or the green area, but we weren't allowed to put extra turbines onto the network to generate the red bits of the outputs you'd see from a tidal turbine. So we looked at things for storage, and that could we use batteries, could we use flywheels, could we use a whole variety of different systems. We very quickly centered on hydrogen because of its opportunity for long duration storage and the high power output you can get from it when you really need it. So what we looked at is whether we could actually take this energy that we're not allowed to put onto the grid because the grid's too small. Could we electrolyze it, turn it into hydrogen, store it, and then turn it back into electricity in the gaps between the tidal generation outputs, and so end up with a resultant output of a uniform power output, which is really sort of the great goal of renewables, is to try and provide as solid an output as possible. So that's what we started off doing, but we did some analytical work shortly afterward, after we committed to the electrolyzer, which showed something really interesting. And that is, if you look at the value of hydrogen as pounds per kilogram, and if you look at it in terms of turning it back into electricity, i.e. regenerating hydrogen back into electricity, it's worth about 30 pence a kilogram. Whereas if you use it for propulsion at the other end of the graph, we were looking at ferries in particular, but it's worth about £4.60 a kilogram, or even more if you're using it for fuel cell cars. So the point is, we've realized that in fact having hydrogen means you've got a good propulsion fuel, and that's what we are centering on. You're noticing that heating is the fourth one from the left, the 1.2 pounds a kilogram. And so this is why I'm saying we're taking a different direction. So that which Matt was suggesting earlier. So this is important to us because as an island community, we use a lot of fuel in our ferries, and that ferry in the top left-hand corner, so uses around about 16 megawatt hours of diesel a day. There are 9 of them up here. So these are quite big energy sinks. So how does it fit in the energy picture as a whole? Well, some study work was done by Aquaterra, as part of a project which David was involved in back in the day, called Reflex, which came up with an energy audit, which looked at how energy is used in our community. On the left-hand side, you can see buildings, road transport, going down to aviation's the orangey line, and then marine transport is the blue block at the bottom. And the right-hand column of that, under the 19, shows the fuels we actually use: kerosene, electricity, etc., etc. And we can see how those break out. And basically, what it comes down to is we use that amount for heat and light, and this amount for transport. And even the transport breaks out into land, air, and sea. So you can see sea transport is a noticeable chunk of our energy use in these islands. So we were looking at whether there are ways that we could use hydrogen as a propulsion fuel for shipping first and foremost, and in doing so break through some challenges. And the point is that islands are quite important. I mean, admittedly, not everybody lives on an island, but some work was done in Europe a little while ago that said if you join together all the populations of the people who live on islands in the EU, they would be the 8th largest state. So the point is that a lot of people live on islands, and so the whole issues of islandness and island transport has got replicability. It's not universally, but it does apply in a lot of areas. And that's why it's too important to us. The we know from what was the work that's gone on in Orkney over the years is we know a lot about our electricity and done very well at it. So every year since 2013, we've produced more electricity than we've actually needed from renewables. But the point is we've only done that bit of the energy problem. We've only done about 1/5 of the job. So what can we do to electrify more of our more of our transport and heating, etc. So we've looked at this, and luckily we've been at this for quite a while, because we've been working with the local university online, and occasionally will actually send us the information when we ask for it, that actually shows what's been going on in the Orkney grid. And this is some real-time information, and it's been scraped from the web by Aquaterra, the company I mentioned earlier, and that shows that the red line is the energy generated line, is the electrical demand within Orkney. And the point is, we know how much energy we need, we know how much electricity we're making, we know what we could afford to put into other things, and together that gives us a good picture as to what is the art of the possible. And so one of the takeaways from this is, you've really got to know what you want, and you've really got to know what you've got, because if you can get those two figures, then you can really see what is actually possible rather than what you think is possible. Oh, the time series that I meant to bring up at the bottom is simply an indication of what's happened every day since 2006. And each cell is a day. Each vertical line is basically a month, from 2006 on the left-hand side to 2016 on the right. And a red cell indicates that electricity was being imported to the county. Amber was about neutral, and green was solidly exporting. And the point is, you can see over more and more renewables are being brought into the picture, and indeed some of the marine renewables are starting to contribute to that now. They weren't really by 2016, but we are now in a position where we could be seeing 7 or 8% of our electricity coming from tidal turbines at the moment. So the point is, we have an indication of where we need to use energy. We have an indication of the energy that we've got available from renewables at the moment. And therefore, we were looking beyond that to what would happen, say, in 2030. And in 2030, we basically believe that, frankly, everything will be electricity. It won't necessarily stay at electricity, but it will have been electricity at some stage. And we believe that the electricity will be used in a variety of ways. One, direct at point of use. So electric cars are more efficient than fossil fuel cars. We firmly believe there'll be some shipping that will be electric, and some small amounts of aviation. We think that the majority of heat will be supplied to people's houses by heat pumps. And indeed, that's the predominant form of heating that's installed in Orkney at the moment. And then more electricity will be used through electrolysis to make a couple of things: either synthetic hydrocarbons, by taking carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, combining that with hydrogen. And if the carbon source is non-fossil, we have a means of producing fuels without effectively without climate impact. And the other thing we'd probably do with electrolysis is producing ammonia, because it's chemically straightforward to produce. So this is the world we see as coming in the future. So we think electrolysis is going to play a significant part in what goes on, principally in the transportation side, and principally in those bits of transportation which are difficult to do. We don't see much future for hydrogen just left as hydrogen. We think it's going to be combined with something else, because it makes it much, much easier to handle, but time will tell whether that's actually the case. So what's been going on in Orkney specifically with hydrogen? We have been working really as an enabler of technologies to try and help people get ideas tried out, because if you remember back to the earlier slide, I said it's all about those 5 steps of reliability and installability and all the rest. So we have been trying to remove barriers to people trying to make renewables work and find their maximum space. And we've been working with a company called Zero Avia, who have been trying hydrogen flights. And they've just, I think it was last week, achieved a flight of that Dornier aircraft on pure hydrogen, which they are then turning to electricity in the air in a fuel cell, and then propelling the aircraft. We've also done work with a company called Zero Petroleum, where we hosted an e-fuels plant which made synthetic gasoline out of our hydrogen and carbon monoxide, and that was used by the RAF in their first ever fully synthetically fueled flight. And we've also been working with a company called Repsol, who own the Flotter oil terminal, to look at the conversion of the oil terminal to a hydrogen production facility. Interestingly, although we started off trying to work on shipping, we failed to get hydrogen aboard vessels so far, mainly due to regulatory problems. But what's happened really as a result of the work we have been doing is we built up hydrogen knowledge in things like the production, in the storage and transport, the skills and the supply of gas. And that itself is then providing a useful opportunity to show off what we can do and give people employment and useful activity. And when I say showing it off, we believe there's a strong role, and there's an invitation here to actually show people what is going on, which is to see how different the energy system will be in the future and actually make it real for people. And this was Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who was the energy minister before last, I think. I don't know, what time is it? Yes, the one before last. And Richard Graham, MP, up looking at one of the tidal turbines with Andrew Scott from Orbital Marine Power, and with David Duggett here looking at the hydrogen transport trailers. And then we had the pleasure of having the Duke of Duchess of Cambridge up to see the turbine and also our fuel cell operations. So we try and have a real push to try and make it real, to normalize hydrogen, and help people understand that this is something that is coming and indeed is actually already here. And more recently, we've been working with putting the second version of our electrolyzer in place from ITM. We've put in a flow battery. The shed in the background is a 1.8 megawatt hour battery storage system comprising 48 flow batteries, which will deliver 600 kilowatts. And that's to support the hydrogen plant to operate during those dips, as I showed you in the tidal output. But the big thing that's really going to be coming down the track, oh, sorry, and we've also been working with the airport here, in this combined heat power unit, which is supplying heat to the airport terminal and electricity to operate the airport. But I don't know if you get this tan, or if you are, I apologise. And that's the CHP operating, and that steam coming out of it, by the way, not smoke. And then we've also been doing work more with Zero Avia down in Cotswold Airport, helping them with the refueling of their hydrogen aircraft. But the big thing that's going to be coming at us in the future is this hydrogen as a future energy vector, because we really do see it as an alternative to the grid. Because if you look at things like, say, the ScotWind leasing round, which is happening, there's some 28 gigawatts, and that's going to be sort of added to by further ScotWind rounds, which could be 125 gigawatts or so. And bearing in mind the UK has probably got about 45 gigawatts online at the moment. You know, this is a huge amount of new energy that's going to be injected into the north of Scotland. And we honestly think there's a problem here, because this is the map of the national grid. And the point is that we're not even on the national grid. So to get that power into it represents a massive change that's going to be required. So we think probably hydrogen is going to be a way in which this is going to happen. And this is why we're working with Repsol Sinopec on the opportunities to convert their existing oil terminal to a hydrogen production facility, which will then allow them to export energy from offshore wind turned into hydrogen and then sent down country. So what have we been doing overall? Our impact as an organisation has been very much based around learning by doing, and creating that pre-commercial knowledge based on practical demonstration. And I'm pleased to say at the moment we're making some real progress, and that progress is really in all three vectors of land, sea and air. So if you do get a chance to come and see us, you know, please do come, and we can organise some trips and see certain bits and pieces of this. But, you know, I really do welcome any questions that people have got about this. And I'll now stop sharing a hand back to David.
That was excellent, Neil. Thank you very much. Lots of exciting learning happening in Orkney, and that was a great overview there. So I want to, I'm going to open the floor to questions, and I'll ask my colleagues to help me navigate, because these two talks have really stimulated a lot of interest, as you would expect. And I would like to come to you first, Matthew. Okay, Matthew Scott, because it's a big challenge when looking at the social implications of the energy transition, and we've all had it really front and center regarding fuel poverty and the cost of living crisis we're living in. So hydrogen at this kind of formative stage of development has a chance to do things differently. So the big question to you is, how could we ensure that the system costs of bringing hydrogen more integrated into our energy services, how do you achieve this fair distribution of that burden in society in terms of that hydrogen investment cost? Do you have a view on that with your NEA perspective?
I think if I had the answer to that question, I'd be banging on the door of beers a lot louder than I currently am. It's an essential question, and it's one that we don't have a conclusive answer to at the moment. I think NEA's broad view has been that distributing these costs through the energy bill would predominantly be regressive. The reason for that is that with electricity, when costs were loaded onto the energy bill to pay for subsidies for electricity, you could see an argument there because everybody uses electricity. It's a fundamental, I don't know the figure, but you would think 98, 99% of UK households use electricity in one shape or another. So you could see a wider societal benefit coming through the tariffs that were introduced there. With hydrogen, it's much less certain. One of the pathways that we've examined in the past involves hydrogen heating for homes, but only in very limited geographical areas. So around production and transportation centres, perhaps like Teesside or like other similar places. So there might be a large proportion of the UK that doesn't see hydrogen in the home because it doesn't make economic sense. The networks can't get there. And is it right for that? For all households to be paying something that only a small proportion of households will actually get. So there's a broader kind of geographical argument, and then there's also the related argument that NEA have made in the past with regards to electricity, as to it disproportionately impacts the lowest earners, those who are least able to pay proportionally more. So it's difficult, and I think there was a really good question in the chat as well about what is the combination of mechanisms with regards to how all of these costs are worked out. We don't have the answer yet, but it's something that we're trying to work with others to sort out and to work through in the coming years.
Thank you for that, Matthew. I mean, that question is it's one of the big questions about the energy transition, and we know how practices today in terms of settlement deals with Ofgem, and we see a lot of broad socializing of the costs of network reinforcement investments with really little consideration of who is in the most need, who is impacted adversely. So yeah, we seem to have this intrinsic kind of asymmetry in how we're balancing the costs and the returns and the wealth distribution. So thank you for that, Matthew. A question for you, Neil. And Neil, I think you made this point very clearly regarding learning by doing and the integration challenges that the grid really seems to be bottlenecking in certain regards regarding the future expansion of hydrogen and other green options in and around Orkney. So my first question really is, in terms of further investment in green hydrogen, which seems to be the focus, I'm pleased to say, do you see hydrogen as a way to circumnavigate these issues regarding grid constraints, or do you actually want to see more of a kind of proactive engagement with network reinforcement as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I don't see that we're going to be able to make hydrogen work particularly well unless we are integrated with the grid, principally because we know that renewables are going to have a variable output, and electrolysis being an electrochemical process, it likes steady states where possible. And indeed, if you're going to do things with the hydrogen, like turn it into fuels, they do like stability. So I can see an occasion when we're going to be largely running on renewables and occasionally taking energy from the grid in order to keep some of the chemical processes stable, even if it's just keep alive or just ride through gaps. So I don't think there's going to be sort of real grid apartheid. I don't think we're going to have sort of absolutely no mixing. The other thing is we've got to be really careful we don't overinvest in the grid, when in fact we might then want to move the energy around by gas. Now, if anybody's got an answer to this, I'd be really interested in it, because it's an argument we're having in the office at the moment, is that I've seen figures that show that you can get about 5 to 10 times as much energy down a pipe as you can a cable of the same diameter. So if you need to move bulk energy from the top of the country to the bottom, burying a pipeline is quite easy. Dangling a lot of wires down pylons down the A9 is going to be really quite hard. Or you've got to put a raft of cables, 10 cables or one pipe sort of thing, down in the North Sea. So I think that we've got to be really careful. We invest in the grid for what we want to do. Now, personally, I believe we'll end up using a high-speed gas grid for moving large amounts of hydrogen down country. But personally, I hope we don't then send that to people's houses, because I think that's a rather inefficient use of that hydrogen. I think it's better things we can do with it. But as the reuse of the gas transmission system, I think is really useful. The reuse of the gas distribution system, I think they're going to have some efficiency problems with that, personally.
Yeah. It's an interesting challenge, that one, and there's the uncertainty around kind of infrastructure readiness causes a lot of hesitation in growth and investment in this space, and I get that sense from you that there is a lot of gaps about the pathways to integration.
So there are gaps. However, I would suggest that the gaps will quickly become, if we do get on and do something now and we're wrong, it's going to be lost very quickly, because the scale of the change that's coming is going to simply erase those gaps. So even if you are wildly wrong, I just don't think it's going to be catastrophically wrong. So the danger is that we stand around trying to find the perfect solution, and by the time we find it, we've boiled the oceans. We've just got to get on with this and do something. And the whole learning by doing piece is absolutely fundamental, and it's actually quite cheap. If you get on and do something and learn now, you learn cheaply.
Yeah. And I suppose just on that comment, Neil, I mean, and it was great to hear about the collaborations with, I think it was Cornwall Airport, maybe.
Kemble Airfield
the aviation project there, where there's clearly a bit of, so yeah, just to say, it sounds like you've taken on some of the growing pains and then sharing the learning with other communities, which is excellent. So that's great. Now I'm going to, it was really interesting to get that EMEC perspective on other uses of hydrogen, and of course the reference to heavy transport, be it, ferries, planes, etc. I'm going to come back to you, Matthew, about this piece about, people and homes, and hydrogen, and just building on that view that you were representing. I mean, what would you see, given the ambitions we see for, decarbonisation by 2030, that possible transition pathway to hydrogen in homes? I mean, do you have a view on that, Matthew? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I realised. It's a really interesting question, and the government has set out a fairly clear pathway for how it intends to do this. So this is blending trials, which have already taken place, hydrogen town trials, which I believe the first hydrogen town trial will be announced this year, potentially quite soon, if I'm remembering correctly. And then a larger hydrogen village trial towards the end of the decade. And the intention behind these is that this will gather the evidence that's required to make a decision on whether it's actually feasible, how it would work, and to gather all of the evidence regarding the things I've been talking about, really, regarding safety and regarding what the different cost implications are. So the pathway that the government has set out is a sensible one, really. I think the the kind of the priority for NEA within that is to ensure that the transition is planned and managed in such a way that it delivers maximum benefit to fuel poor households. There's a lot of reasons why we need to do this. The first is just social and energy justice. We need to ensure that any transition to net zero in the whole passes through the homes of poor households. Whether that's thinking about fuel poor schemes, like I've been talking about, whether it's thinking more about how those costs are distributed. I'm just going to pause there, David, because I've had a message saying my internet connection's unstable, so I'm not sure how much you've caught.
No, we caught, you just, we lost you for like 10 seconds.
Okay.
So, I mean, please do recap just that final statement, that point you were making.
Yeah, it's a broad point really about the, whatever the pathway is, we have to embed the needs and requirements of fuel poor households within that from the very beginning. If we get to the end of that transition pathway and then we think, right, we just need to bolt on fuel poor households at the end, we've done the main work, then we figure out afterwards how to make it work for this smaller group, then it's not going to work, it's going to go badly. So we need to be thinking right now about what that pathway looks like for fuel poor households specifically, and we need to be building that into the work that we do going forward from this point.
That's excellent, Matthew. Thank you very much. So we've only got about 2 minutes left. So I wanted to kind of give a bit of a summary comment, and I would also like to offer that, and I'll ask my colleagues to help me to glean some of these excellent questions off the meeting chat, and we'll come back to our two speakers to get a response from them. Perhaps we can ask you for that, just a wee bit of commentary on those questions, and we can make that available with your approval through our portal. So I want to reflect on these two talks, because it's really interesting that, you know, getting it right by design, the point that Matthew's making here, I feel, about the social inclusion, the techno-economic cost of energy, and, you know, really thinking about that service and the value on that service from new interventions, such as through hydrogen. Then Neil's comments about learning by doing and getting that pragmatic learning, that commercial learning, and demonstrating and building confidence. It's clearly important, I think, at this time in the energy transition, that we do more, we invest more. Emissions are an accumulative effect in our environment. So even small gains we make now aggregate, okay? So any decarbonisation that we can achieve now is worth the doing, obviously. But I'm also very mindful of the social factors. I'm sure many of you will have seen some of the publicity around the Whitby and the work of Cadent in looking at green hydrogen villages. And I think that's a really interesting piece about, I think we're seeing the dialogue move up a level beyond just engagement with energy users and stakeholders to really having to be more about that real meaningful engagement and real meaningful kind of participation in the energy transition, because there's been massive benefits, but obviously very strong advocates against some of the energy transition interventions happening in communities. So I think there's something really interesting in that about our practices in terms of how we support communities, how we develop technologies, and how we demonstrate that evidence base that allows us to invest in further decarbonisation moving forward. So, I mean, I would like to extend my thanks on behalf of all of the HIAC team for today's two speakers. Really insightful, rich learning, and I'm sure everyone on the call would hold you all hostage in your own right and interrogate you for hours at end, but we can't let them do that to you. But we welcome continued conversations with you, as with the attendees, because we're all part of this pathway moving forward, and it's clearly complicated, and I think we're going to have to work together as we go through this. So thank you all for your time. We will follow up on some of the questions that we couldn't get answered in the time allocation, and please do stay in touch with the HIAC team, and we'll follow up with our 2 speakers in due course. But for now, thank you very much for your time. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
See you, David. Bye all.
Thank you.